Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, the test 2 of the pre-parikshan is live now. We would want all of you to attempt the test and see how well you are prepared for the coming prelims examination. The window to attempt the test is going to end soon and hence you should spare 2 hours from your schedule and attempt the test, thereby improving your chance to clear the prelims examination. From the entire team of Rouse IAS, we wish you all the very best. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 26th of September 2020 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. Now the first article appears on page number 6 and is titled as Parliamentary Scrutiny on the Back Burner. The main role of the Parliament is to carry out the 3 Ds, that is debate, discussion and dissent. This is primarily done through the parliamentary committees. Earlier, Parliament used to rely on the parliamentary committees in order to fulfill its role effectively. However, recently during the Parliament session, a number of controversial bills were introduced, such as the bills related to the agricultural marketing, the bills related to the labour codes and so on. Given the widespread opposition and concerns raised with respect to these bills, ideally these bills should have been referred to the parliamentary standing committees for their in-depth and close examination. However, as the recent instance shows, Parliament's reliance on the parliamentary committees is reducing. In this regard, this particular lead article here highlights that in the recent days, Parliament's reliance on the parliamentary committees is reducing, and this in turn is affecting Parliament's dual role of making laws and ensuring the accountability of the government. In this regard, we shall be discussing the various dimensions of the parliamentary committees, such as what exactly are the parliamentary committees, the types of parliamentary committees, some of the important parliamentary committees, then the importance, issues, and the need to strengthen the parliamentary standing committees. Apart from that, as you can see here, this particular topic of the parliamentary standing committees is quite important both from the perspective of prelims as well as the mains examination. Further, before going through this particular analysis, I would suggest you to test yourself through these questions. The 2 mains-based questions that can be expected from this particular topic have been highlighted on your screen for your reference. Let us start with the analysis of the first dimension. In a parliamentary democracy such as ours, the main role of the parliament is twofold. Firstly, to make laws, and secondly, to ensure the accountability of the government. However, in order to perform these 2 functions efficiently, the Parliament faces 2 constraints. The first constraint is related to the time constraint and the second constraint is related to the necessary technical expertise. With respect to the first constraint, the Parliament meets for 3 sessions in a year, that is the monsoon session, budget session and the winter session. Now, according to a research carried out by the PRS Legislative Research, on an average in the last 10 years, the Parliament has met only for 67 days in a year. So the time required for the Parliament to take up the in-depth analysis of various bills or to ensure the financial accountability of the government of India is quite lower. Similarly, in the recent years, due to rapid advancement in the technology, the governance as such has become highly technical in nature. The members of Parliament come from various educational backgrounds and they may be considered to be laymen when dealing with matters of highly technical importance. For example, matters related to surrogacy, matters related to the genetically modified crops, matters related to various WTO agreements and so on. Hence, in order to address these 2 constraints related to time as well as expertise, the Parliament has provided for the parliamentary committees. The Indian Constitution makes a mention about the parliamentary committees at various places. However, the Indian Constitution has not made any explicit provisions related to the parliamentary committees, such as their composition, the manner of appointment of the members, their mandate, etc. The parliamentary committees derive their authority from Article 118 of the Indian Constitution. Article 118 empowers the Indian Parliament to make rules governing its business. Accordingly, if you look at the broad features of the parliamentary committees, a parliamentary committee should be appointed or elected by the House, or it can be nominated even by the chairperson. So in case of the Lok Sabha, it can be the Lok Sabha Speaker, or in case of Rajya Sabha, it can be the Rajya Sabha Chairman. Once a parliamentary committee is formed, it should work under the supervision of the chairperson. It should submit report to the chairperson once its task is completed, and it should be supported by the secretariat of either of the houses. So if a committee fulfills these 4 features, then we can call such a committee as a parliamentary committee. Now, depending upon the tenure for which the parliamentary committees are set up, the parliamentary committees are basically 2 types. That is the standing committees and the ad hoc committees. Now, the standing committees are the permanent committees. They keep on working continuously throughout the year, and these committees as such may be constituted every year or periodically. On the other hand, the ad hoc committees are considered to be the non-permanent committees, that is, they are temporary committees. They may be set up for a specific reason, and they cease to exist upon the completion of the task which is assigned to them. Now, depending upon the nature of functions carried out by the standing committees, we can have different types of standing committees, such as the financial committees, out of which the most important ones are the Public Accounts Committee, Estimates Committee, Committee on Public Sector Undertakings. Then we have the departmental standing committees. Then the parliamentary committees to inquire. For example, we have the Committee on Petitions, Committee on Privileges, the Ethics Committee. Then the parliamentary committees to scrutinize and control the government. For example, we have the Parliamentary Committee on the Government Assurances, the Committee on Subordinate Legislation, etc. Then the committees that deal with the day-to-day business, such as the Business Advisory Committee, Rules Committee, etc. Under the ad hoc committees, we have 2 types of committees, that is the Enquiry Committee and the Advisory Committee. As the name suggests, the Enquiry Committees are the committees that are set up to inquire into the important matters of the public importance. The Enquiry Committees can be set up in mainly 2 ways. First and foremost, they can be set up when either of the houses of the parliament passes a resolution to set up an Enquiry Committee. Secondly, the Enquiry Committee can also be set up based upon the decision of the chairperson of either the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha. Some of the Enquiry Committees which have been set up in the past include the Enquiry Committee dealing with the Bofors scam, the Enquiry Committee dealing with the stock market scam, and so on. Second, we have the Advisory Committee. As the name suggests, the Advisory Committees are basically set up in order to advise the Parliament on the matters of the legislative importance, that is, when the important bills are presented before the Parliament. When we say the Select Committee would comprise of the MPs from a single house, that is either the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha. On the other hand, the Joint Committee will comprise of the MPs from both the houses of the Parliament. See, the basic mandate of the Select or the Joint Committee is to carry out the detailed examination of the bill that has been presented before the houses of the Parliament. These advisory committees carry out a detailed examination of the bills. They try to find out various lacunae in the bill and give appropriate suggestions. In order to do so, these advisory committees ask for views or opinions from the common public, the stakeholders, experts, etc. See, how to understand that not all the bills are sent to the advisory committees for their examination. There are basically 3 ways in which these advisory committees can be set up. First and foremost, whenever the minister is presenting a bill either before the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha, the minister himself can recommend that the bill can be referred to a select or a joint committee of the Parliament. For example, last year, when the Minister for Electronics and Information Technology, Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad, had introduced the Personal Data Protection Bill, that time the Minister had recommended that such a bill should be scrutinized by a joint committee of the Parliament. Secondly, if the Minister does not recommend for a bill to be examined by either a select or a joint committee, in that particular case, the presiding officer of the House can recommend a bill to be taken up by the advisory committee for its scrutiny. Thirdly, when one house of the Parliament passes a bill, the bill goes to the another house. In another house, the members may decide to refer this particular bill to a select committee. Now, for example, if a bill has been passed by the Lok Sabha and sent to the Rajya Sabha, in the Rajya Sabha, the members may decide to refer this particular bill to a select committee of Rajya Sabha. Usually, the select or the joint committees are required to submit the report to the Parliament within 3 months, but sometimes it may take longer than 3 months. Please do note that the reports submitted by these committees are basically recommendatory in nature. That means it is up to the government whether to accept these recommendations or not. Now, out of all of these parliamentary committees, the most important parliamentary committees happens to be the Public Accounts Committee, Estimates Committee, Committee on PSUs, and the Departmental Standing Committees. So what we will do here is we will discuss about these three committees in much greater detail. As far as the other committees are concerned, the details of these committees have been given in the PDF for your reference. I hope you would be able to go through these committees on your own, and in case of any doubts, you can simply post a query in the comment section given below. Next, coming to the important parliamentary committees. Now, if you carry out an in-depth analysis of the previous year prelims questions, you would get to know that a large number of questions have been asked with respect to the important parliamentary committees such as the Public Accounts Committee, the Estimates Committee, Committee on PSUs, Departmental Standing Committees, and so on. Normally, the students do not get confused as far as the mandate of these committees is concerned. This is because if you look at the name of the committee, automatically you will get to know as to what is its mandate. However, the students find problems or confusion with respect to the other aspects of these committees. That is, how many members a committee has, how these members are appointed, what is the duration, how is the chairperson of these committees appointed, and so on. Hence, keeping in mind the demand of the UPSC prelims as well as keeping in mind the places where the students are likely to get confused, I have prepared this particular table in order to simplify your understanding of the parliamentary committees. Coming now to the first one, that is the Public Accounts Committee. The Office of CAG basically submits two important audit reports to the Parliament. The first one is the audit report on the appropriation accounts, and the second one is the audit report on the finance accounts. The audit report on the appropriation accounts basically compares the total expenditure incurred by the government in a financial year with the expenditure that has been sanctioned by the Parliament. So through the audit report on the appropriation accounts, the CAG tries to find out as to the money that has been utilized by the government, whether that particular money was sanctioned by the Parliament. Secondly, whether the money which has been used by the government, whether it was used for the purpose for which it was sanctioned by the Parliament. Thirdly, whether the money was spent by following the relevant rules and procedures or not. Similarly, the audit report on the finance account basically tells us as to how much amount of revenue the government has earned, from which all sources the government has earned the revenue, how much revenue it has transferred to the states, and so on. So these reports published by the CAG are extremely critical in order to ensure the financial accountability of the government towards the Parliament. However, these reports submitted by the CAG are not only voluminous but they are technical as well. So it becomes quite difficult for the Parliament to carry out the in-depth analysis of the reports submitted by the CAG. Hence, in order to address this particular problem, we have the Public Accounts Committee that has been vested with the authority to examine the audit reports once they are submitted by the CAG. In fact, the Public Accounts Committee is assisted by CAG in order to fulfill its functions. Accordingly, CAG is considered to be the friend, guide, and philosopher of the Public Accounts Committee. This committee has basically 22 members, out of which 15 members are from Lok Sabha and 7 members of Rajya Sabha. These members are elected by the Parliament every year from amongst its members through the method of proportional representation by means of single transferable vote. Accordingly, each and every political party gets due representation according to its strength under the Public Accounts Committee. The members are appointed for a tenure of 1 year. As far as the chairperson is concerned, the chairperson of the Public Accounts Committee is appointed by the Speaker from amongst the 22 members of the Public Accounts Committee. Until 1967, usually the chairperson of the Public Accounts Committee used to be a person from the ruling party. However, since 1967, a healthy convention has been developed wherein usually it is the person who belongs to the opposition party who gets appointed as the head of the Public Accounts Committee. Further, please do note that a minister is not allowed to be a member of the Public Accounts Committee. One of the biggest criticisms that has been leveled against the Public Accounts Committee is that it carries out the post-mortem examination of the accounts. That is, it carries out an examination of the accounts after the expenditure has already been incurred by the government. Accordingly, some of the critics have pointed out that the Public Accounts Committee is not as effective as it is made out to be. What do you think about the criticism that has been leveled against the Public Accounts Committee? See, in our counter argument, we can actually argue that we do have a Public Accounts Committee which will be carrying out the post-mortem examination of the government accounts. Would mean that government as such would be much more careful while undertaking the expenditure. The government as such would ensure that it is spending money according to the appropriation made by the parliament. The government would ensure that the money would be spent only for the purpose for which it has been sanctioned for. Government will follow all the necessary rules and regulations in undertaking expenditure. The government will also ensure efficiency in public expenditure. Just imagine what would have happened if Public Accounts Committee was not there. In that particular case, there would have been no legislative oversight over the government, which in turn would have reduced the government's accountability towards the parliament. That is the strength of the Public Accounts Committee. So it forces the government to be much more prudent as well as efficient with respect to the public expenditure. Next, coming to the Estimates Committee. See, whenever the Finance Minister presents the budget, the Finance Minister presents the estimates of the expenditure as well as revenue. For example, in a particular financial year, the Finance Minister may estimate that the total expenditure of the government could be around rupees 150. He may also estimate that the total revenue which the government is expected to earn for the upcoming financial year is rupees 100. So in order to bridge this particular deficit, the Finance Minister can estimate that the total borrowings of the government would be in the range of rupees 50. So the Finance Minister basically presents the estimates in terms of expenditure, revenue, borrowings, etc. whenever he presents the budget. Not all the times these estimates presented by the Finance Minister may be efficient or financially prudent. For example, there could be a possibility to reduce the expenditure of the government by rationalizing its expenditure. Similarly, there could be a possibility to enhance the overall revenue of the government and reduce the borrowings and so on. So by following alternate policies, it is quite possible for the government to enhance its efficiency as to how it is managing the public finances. Hence, to help the government in this particular regard, we do have the Estimates Committee. Please do note that unlike the Public Accounts Committee, the Estimates Committee comprises of 30 members and all of these 30 members are from Lok Sabha. So the members from the Rajya Sabha are not given the representation in the Estimates Committee. These members, just like the Public Accounts Committee, are elected by the Parliament every year amongst its members through the method of proportional representation by single transferable vote, which once again means that all the political parties get due representation in the Estimates Committee. The members are appointed for a period of 1 year. As far as the chairperson is concerned, here the chairperson is appointed by the speaker from amongst the 30 members from the Lok Sabha. And unlike the Public Accounts Committee, in this particular case, the chairperson of the Estimates Committee belongs to the ruling party. Next, we have the Committee on the Public Sector Undertakings. See, all the public sector undertakings which are owned and controlled by the central government, they are required to submit their annual reports and the annual accounts to the Government of India. Hence, in order to examine these reports as well as accounts, we do have the Committee on PSUs. Apart from that, the Office of CAG submits the audit report on the PSUs. This is in addition to the audit report on the appropriation account and the audit report on the finance accounts. So the Committee on PSUs basically carries out the examination of the CAG reports of the PSUs. This committee has 22 members, 15 from the Lok Sabha, 7 from the Rajya Sabha. They are elected by the Parliament every year. Just as the members of the Public Account Committee and the Estimates Committee, they are appointed for a period of 1 year. As far as the chairperson is concerned, the chairperson is a person who is appointed by the speaker from amongst its members, and he must compulsorily be from the Lok Sabha. And a member of Rajya Sabha cannot become a chairperson of the Committee on the PSUs. Lastly, coming to the departmental standing committees, see, whenever the Finance Minister presents the budget, the Finance Minister presents important bills and documents for the scrutiny and the passage of both the houses of the Parliament. For example, the Finance Minister presents the Appropriation Bill, the Finance Bill, the demand for grants of different ministries, and so on. The Appropriation Bill basically tells us as to how much money the government would withdraw from the Consolidated Fund of India, and for what purpose this particular money would be utilized for. So the appropriation bill in the budget deals with the expenditure side of the government. The finance bill, on the other hand, deals with the income side of the budget, wherein the finance bill basically incorporates various changes related to the taxation law. For example, if the government is making any changes to the income tax slabs, if the government is making changes to the corporate tax rates and so on, all of these changes would be incorporated under the finance bill. Next, we have the demand for grants, wherein each and every ministry under the government of India is required to present its demand for grant, wherein basically each and every ministry is asking the parliament to sanction certain amount of money for a specific purpose. Now, for example, if you have a look at the demand for grant for the agriculture ministry for the year 2020-21, in this particular document, you would come across that the Ministry of Agriculture has asked for money from the parliament for various heads, such as the money for Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, National Food Security Mission, and so on. So through the demand for grants, the agriculture ministry is basically saying the parliament as to how much of money does it need for each of its schemes as well as programs. So here the main role of the departmental standing committee is to analyze the demand for grants presented for different ministries. So the departmental standing committee basically analyzes whether the money that is spent by the different ministries on department on its schemes and programs, whether it is efficiently used or not. So usually when the finance minister presents the budget, after the presentation of the budget, a general discussion on the budget takes place for 2 to 3 days. After the general discussion, the demand for grants presented by different ministries is then sent to the departmental standing committees. So these departmental standing committees are then required to analyze the demand for grants of the different ministries within a particular time frame, and after the completion of the time frame, they are required to submit their recommendations before the parliament. So based upon the recommendations given by the departmental standing committee, then the voting on demand for grants take place. As you must be aware, during the voting on demand for grants that takes place in the Lok Sabha, 3 types of cut motions can be moved, that is the policy cut, token cut, and economic cut. Please let us know in the comment section as to what are the differences between these 3 types of cut motions. Apart from considering the demand for grants of different ministries, the departmental standing committee also examine the bills which are presented by different ministries. They also consider the annual reports of different ministries. Now, if you look at the total number of ministries in India, it is more than 80. However, if you look at the number of departmental standing committees, then it is around 24. Now, we have less number of departmental standing committees as compared to the number of ministries, because for the larger ministries and departments, we do have a single departmental standing committee. Now, for example, the Ministry of Railways is quite bigger. Accordingly, we have a single departmental standing committee on railways. On the other hand, with respect to transport sector, we do have different ministries such as the Ministry of Shipping, Road Transport, Ministry of Civil Aviation, and so on. But for all of these ministries, we do have a single departmental standing committee known as the Departmental Standing Committee on Transport. That is why we have less number of departmental standing committees as compared to the number of ministries and departments. So for all of these ministries that are related to transport, that is shipping, roadways, civil aviation, etc., it is a departmental standing committee on transport that will examine the demand for grants. It will examine the bills related to these ministries and departments. It will also consider the annual reports. Each of these 24 departmental standing committees has 31 members, 21 members from Lok Sabha and 10 members from the Rajya Sabha. These members are nominated by their respective presiding officers. These members are appointed for a period of 1 year. Out of the 24 departmental standing committees, 16 committees function under the purview of the Lok Sabha, and the chairpersons of these committees are appointed by the Lok Sabha Speaker. The remaining 6 committees work under the purview of the Rajya Sabha, and the chairpersons of these committees are appointed by the chairman of the Rajya Sabha. So please do make a note of these important parliamentary committees, which becomes quite important with respect to your prelims examination. Coming to the last dimension, which becomes important from the perspective of the mains examination, In this dimension, we shall be discussing the importance, issues and strengthening of the parliamentary standing committees in India. As far as importance is concerned, as highlighted before, the parliament does not have the necessary time or the expertise in order to carry out the in-depth analysis of various legislative bills. It also cannot ensure the financial accountability of the government continuously. That is where the parliamentary standing committees come into picture, and hence the parliamentary standing committees are referred to as the eyes, ear and brain of the parliament. Since the parliamentary standing committees work throughout the year continuously, the parliamentary standing committees such as the Public Accounts Committee, the Estimates Committee and so on, they ensure detailed, close, continuous and in-depth control of the parliament over the executive. Thirdly, the parliamentary standing committees enable the parliament to formulate law after taking into account the views and opinions of the experts, stakeholders, etc. Now, for example, in order to formulate the Surrogacy Regulation Bill 2016, now this particular bill was considered to be highly technical in nature. It dealt with number of technical issues such as surrogacy, fertility and so on. Accordingly, this particular bill was formulated after consulting a number of healthcare professionals, opinion of the people who have been working in the healthcare industry and so on. See, the parliamentary proceedings are telecasted live. Hence, there is a greater propensity of an individual MP to stick to their party positions on most of the matters, even though individually they may be against their party position. Moreover, since the parliamentary proceedings are telecasted live, most of the debates and discussions in the parliament are actually based upon the political lines. But the meetings of the parliamentary standing committees take place behind the closed door, away from the media glare. Hence, it becomes quite easier for the individual MP to declare his views and opinions that may be in contrast to the stand which is taken by his political party. So, in the parliamentary standing committees, the discussion as such are not politicized. Rather, the discussions are more fruitful as well as meaningful. Apart from that, since the parliamentary standing committees give due representation to all the political parties, these parliamentary standing committees also become a forum in order to build political consensus on important public matters. Lastly, as highlighted before, the parliamentary standing committees such as the Public Accounts Committee, Estimates Committee, etc., they ensure the government's financial accountability to the parliament and thus bring about a greater amount of efficiency and economy in the public expenditure. In spite of the growing importance in a parliamentary democracy such as India, the parliamentary standing committees faces a number of issues. Now, some of these issues have been highlighted in a research paper which has been published by the PRS Legislative Research. First and foremost, according to a research carried out by PRS, there is a decline in terms of both quantity as well as quality of the parliamentary standing committee. As far as the quantity is concerned, here we can analyze the performance of the parliamentary standing committee in terms of parameters such as how many reports they have submitted, what percentage of MPs have been attending the meetings of the parliamentary standing committees and so on. In terms of quality, we can look at to what extent the recommendations given by these committees have been accepted by the parliament. First and foremost, not all the parliamentary standing committees have submitted the requisite number of reports, nor have they submitted the reports on time. For example, highest number of reports have been published by the Public Accounts Committee. However, some of the other committees, particularly the Parliamentary Committee on Ethics, this committee has submitted very less number of reports. Apart from that, usually the departmental standing committees are given a time frame of 3 months to scrutinize a particular bill and give their recommendations. However, a large number of departmental standing committees have been unable to submit their reports within the time frame of 3 months. Thirdly, the impact of a parliamentary standing committee in influencing the policy can be seen from how far its recommendations are accepted by the parliament. However, according to research carried out by PRS, there is very low acceptance of the recommendations given by the parliamentary standing committees. Nextly, in order to formulate strong and effective laws, bills once they are introduced in the parliament, ideally, these bills should be referred to a select or a joint committee in order to improve their outcomes. However, as discussed before, bills once introduced, they are not automatically referred to the select or the joint committee. They can be referred to a select or the joint committee based upon the three methods that we had discussed before. So in the 15th Lok Sabha, almost around 70% of the bills, they were referred to the select committee or the joint committee. However, in the 16th Lok Sabha, this particular percentage has come down to only around 27%. And this clearly shows that the bills may have been passed by the parliament without carrying out a detailed evaluation. Nextly, as highlighted before, now the members of these parliamentary standing committees are appointed for a much shorter tenure of only 1 year. So this shorter tenure of 1 year is a kind of constraint on the members from gaining expertise in their respective fields. Now, for example, let's say a particular MP for one particular year, he gets appointed to the Departmental Standing Committee of Agriculture. Next year, he gets appointed to the Departmental Standing Committee on Defense. Third year, he gets appointed to the Departmental Standing Committee on, let's say, Transport. So as you can see here, every year he is a member of a different departmental standing committee, which in turn prevents him to gain expertise in a particular field. In this regard, recently the Vice President, who also happens to be the chairperson of the Rajya Sabha, had suggested that the members of the Parliamentary Standing Committee should be given a much longer tenure of at least 2 years. So giving them a tenure of 2 years would enable the members of the Parliament to gain the necessary expertise in their fields. Lastly, some of the experts have also pointed out that these parliamentary standing committees do not have adequate amount of research support in order to undertake in-depth and technical analysis of the government expenditure or the analysis of the bills that are considered to be technical in nature. So question is, how do you strengthen the committee system? Now these recommendations have been taken from the National Commission to Review the Working of the Indian Constitution as well as from the research carried out by PRS. First and foremost, we need to develop a healthy convention to refer the bills to the select committees. So whenever there is a feeling that a particular bill is controversial or is being opposed by a large number of members in the parliament, then a healthy convention should be developed wherein these bills should be referred to the select or the joint committees. Apart from that, once a bill is being analyzed by the departmental standing committee or the select committees, these parliamentary committees should ask for views and opinions of the public, experts and various stakeholders. This will strengthen the democratic process and at the same time ensure greater acceptability of the laws. Nextly, usually the recommendations given by the departmental standing committees are not taken up for discussion. So wherever the parliament believes that the suggestions given by the parliamentary standing committee differs from the government's position, then all such matters should be taken up for the discussion by the parliament. Lastly, presently various government officials are required to appear before the parliamentary standing committees. This is done in order to ensure the government officials' accountability to the parliament. However, there are constraints with respect to appearance of the ministers before the parliamentary standing committees. Now, in countries such as UK, the ministers are not only required to appear before the parliamentary standing committees, they are also required to give the answers posed to them. Accordingly, in case of India, we need to make the ministers answerable to the parliamentary standing committees. This would enable the parliamentary standing committees to know the government's position on important issues. The answers to the questions that were posed before the start of a discussion has been presented on your screen. As far as the response to the question number 9 and 10 is concerned, I would want you to find out the answers on your own and respond in the comments section. With this, let us now take up the next article. Now, this particular article appears on page number 1 and is titled as Vodafone Wins the 2 billion tax case. Before understanding the article, let us first look into its background. See, in the year 2007, the Netherlands-based Vodafone company decided to take over Hutchison India SR. Even though Vodafone took over a company that was based in India, this transaction did not take place in India. Rather, this transaction took place in a tax haven country known as the Cayman Islands. Subsequently, the income tax authorities asked the Vodafone company to pay a capital gains tax of almost up to 22,000 crores. However, this particular demand, this was rejected not only by the Vodafone company, but it was rejected even by the Supreme Court. Subsequently, in March 2012, the then UPA government decided to amend the Income Tax Act. Now, this particular amendment introduced by the UPA government was considered to be a retrospective amendment, wherein through this particular amendment, the new provision was made applicable even to the past stated transactions as well. Subsequent to the amendment, the government then issued a tax notice of 14,000 crore to the Vodafone company. However, this was once again rejected by the Vodafone company. Subsequently, in April 2014, Vodafone company decided to initiate the arbitration proceedings. This was initiated under the bilateral investment treaty signed between India and Netherlands. And now, almost after 6 years, in the year 2020, the arbitration tribunal has ruled in the favor of Vodafone, and it has clearly highlighted that India's demand for taxation from the Vodafone is in violation of the bilateral investment treaty. Now, this particular strategy, which was followed by the Vodafone company in order to avoid paying taxes to the Indian government, is referred to as the base erosion and profit shifting. This topic is quite important because in prelims 2016 there was a direct question related to what exactly is the base erosion and profit shifting. This particular topic is also important because the OECD as an institution is trying to come up with various means and mechanisms in order to prevent the multinational companies from adopting base erosion and profit shifting strategies. The base erosion and profit shifting is basically a tax avoidance strategy followed by the multinational companies, wherein these companies try to take undue benefits of the tax exemptions given by them. As part of such a strategy, the multinational companies, they shift their profits from high tax jurisdictions such as India to low tax jurisdictions, particularly the tax haven countries such as Mauritius, Singapore, Switzerland, Cayman Islands, etc. And by doing so, they reduce their tax liability. Now they can carry out the base erosion and profit shifting through the misuse of the double taxation avoidance agreement that India has signed with a number of countries. Now this can be done either through the treaty shopping or the round tripping. Hence, as part of this video analysis, we shall be focusing on the different dimensions such as the meaning, need and significance of the double taxation avoidance agreements, the misuse of the double taxation avoidance, then the concept of the treaty shopping, the concept of the round tripping, and we shall discuss as to what was the Vodafone controversy all about, in particular the retrospective taxation amendment. Now starting with the first dimension, that is what exactly is the double taxation avoidance agreement. See, if you look at the multinational companies, these multinational companies, they may be registered in a single country, but they do have branches across the world. With respect to the application of taxation to these multinational companies are required to pay the tax not only on their domestic income, but they are also required to pay the tax on their global income. Now, for example, Infosys is a multinational company that is headquartered in India. So the Infosys company, it would have to pay tax to the Indian government not only on the revenue that it earns in India, that is part of its domestic income, but also the tax on its global income, that is the profits that it earns from the branches it has outside India. Similarly, Microsoft is a company based in USA. So to the US government, Microsoft would have to pay the tax on the income that it's earned on the headquarters based in USA, plus the income that it earns on the branches outside USA. So keeping in mind this particular principle of taxation, let us look at the economic interaction between India and USA, for example. Now we have an Infosys company that is headquartered in India but has branches in USA. Microsoft company which is headquartered in USA and has branches in India. Let us try to calculate as to what would be the tax liability of these two companies in the respective countries. Now, as far as India is concerned, as highlighted before, Infosys would have to pay the tax to the Indian government for the revenue that it earns within India, as well as on the revenue that it earns outside India, that is on the branches in USA. Similarly, as far as the tax liability of Microsoft in USA is concerned, Microsoft would have to pay the tax on the income that it's earned from the headquarters in USA plus the branches it has in India. Apart from that, as you can see here, Microsoft company would also be required to pay tax to the Indian government for the revenue that it earns from the branches in India. This is so because this becomes part of the resident income for the Indian government. Similarly, Infosys would have to pay the tax on the revenue that it earns from the branches in USA. This is once again because this is a resident income for the US government. Based upon this particular example, you can clearly see here that both Infosys as well as Microsoft are actually paying the double taxes on the branches which they have set up outside their home country. In this particular example, Infosys, for its branches that it has set up in USA, it is first and foremost paying the tax to the Indian government as part of its global income, and it is also paying the tax on its branches in USA to the US government as part of the resident income. The same can be said about Microsoft as well. So whenever a multinational company is setting up a branch outside its home country, on such a branch it is required to pay tax to the home country as part of its global income. It is also paying the tax to the country in which it is establishing its branch as part of the resident income. Now just imagine as to what would happen if the multinational companies are required to pay double taxes whenever they set up branches outside the home country. In that particular case, no multinational company would come forward to set up branches outside the home country. Hence, the payment of the double taxes by the multinational companies would in turn discourage the foreign investment and hinder the development of multinational companies. Now, for example, if Microsoft company had to pay the double taxes for the branches it sets up in India, then Microsoft company, or for that matter any US based company, would not willingly come forward to set up branches in India. Hence, in order to avoid this particular problem, what we have is double taxation avoidance agreement, which is a kind of bilateral agreement that has been signed between two countries. Usually under the double taxation avoidance agreement, it is decided that in whichever country a company's headquarters is located, to that particular country the company would be paying the tax. So in this particular example, Infosys company would be paying the tax only to the Indian government, and the Microsoft company would be paying the tax only to the US government. So through such double taxation avoidance agreement, Infosys company would not be liable to pay tax in USA, and Microsoft company would not be liable to pay the tax in India. Now, so far the Indian government has signed more than 80 double taxation avoidance agreement. Now, there is a lot of complexity involved in each of the double taxation avoidance agreement that has been signed by India. The complexity is in terms of how much amount of tax can be exempted, which all taxes are exempted, and so on. As far as UPSC is concerned, there is no need for you to go into the depth regarding the details of the double taxation avoidance agreement. You need to understand the broad principle behind the working of the double taxation avoidance agreement. The broad principle here is, in whichever country the company's headquarters is located, to that particular country the company would be paying the tax. So if such a company is setting up a branch outside the home country, even then the company would continue to pay the tax only to the country in which its headquarters is located. So what do you think would be the benefit of signing the double taxation avoidance agreement for India? See, first and foremost, this will encourage the foreign investment from other countries. Secondly, whenever an Indian company such as Infosys sets up its branch outside India, then such an Indian company would not be required to pay the tax in the other countries. Let us understand as to how the multinational companies actually misuse the double taxation avoidance agreement that India has signed with a number of countries. Let's consider the example of two companies, company X based in India and has branches in a tax haven country, and a company Y based in a tax haven country and has branches in India. See, as far as the tax haven country is concerned, we do not have any universally accepted definition as to what constitutes a tax haven country. However, the tax haven countries have certain peculiar features. The first peculiar feature is, normally these countries do not impose any taxes. Even if the taxes are imposed, the taxes are very lower. Secondly, these tax haven countries do not share any tax related information with other countries. For example, earlier the Swiss banks, they were reluctant to share the information related to the Indians who had opened the bank accounts in the Swiss banks. So this is a kind of opaqueness with respect to tax administration. Thirdly, in the tax haven countries, we do come across a large number of shell firms. See, when we say shell firms are basically those firms which are registered in a tax haven country, but these companies as such exist only on paper, and they carry out substantial amount of operations by setting up of branches in other countries. So in a tax haven country, these shell firms have very limited presence as such. Now, for example, let's say there is a company that is providing telecommunication services. Now, such a company that is providing telecommunication services may be registered in a tax haven country, let's say Cayman Island. However, in such a tax haven country, this company is not providing the telecommunication services. Rather, this company is providing the telecommunication services by opening branches in other countries. So, such a telecommunication company that is registered in Cayman Island, which exists only on paper, does not carry out the operations in a tax haven country. Such firms in general can be referred to as the shell firms. These shell firms are basically set up in order to avoid payment of taxes. Now, this could be understood by looking at the tax liability of the company Y that is registered in a tax haven country. Now, for example, let's say this company Y is registered in Mauritius. Accordingly, under the terms of the double taxation avoidance agreement, the company Y, it would be required to pay the tax only to the Mauritius government and not to the Indian government. So the company Y would be exempted from paying the tax to the Indian government in India. However, this company, it would be required to pay the tax on its resident income as well as global income to the Mauritius government. But we do know that Mauritius is a tax haven country where the tax rates are either nil or extremely lower. So this company Y is neither paying taxes in India nor is it paying taxes in Mauritius. So this is how a company Y is misusing the provisions of the double taxation avoidance agreement. Next, coming to the concept of the treaty shopping, which is a form of misuse of the double taxation avoidance agreement. Let's understand this through a simple example. Let's say we have investors in third countries such as UK, Hong Kong, Germany, etc. Now these investors, let's say they want to establish a company in India. Now just imagine if these investors directly establish a company in India, then double taxation avoidance agreement would be made applicable between India and the country from where the investors are investing. Let's say in this particular case, UK. So in this particular case, the double taxation avoidance agreement between India and UK would be made applicable. So the investors, when they are making an investment from UK, then under the terms of the double taxation avoidance agreement between India and UK, these investors would be required to pay the tax to the UK government. But if you look at the tax rates between India and UK, the tax rates are almost the same. So there is no benefit for the investors if they make an investment into India directly from their home country. So what is the way out? How can the investors reduce their tax liability? In this particular case, what the investors can typically do is they can register the shell company Y, which is headquartered in a tax haven country such as Mauritius, Switzerland, Singapore, Cayman Island, etc. And from such a tax haven country, they can open branches in India. As discussed in our previous slide, company Y, since it is registered in a tax haven country, it would be liable to pay tax in a tax haven country only, and the tax rates are quite lower or almost nil. Hence, the company Y in this particular case does not pay any kind of tax. So this is a concept of treaty shopping. So under the terms of the treaty shopping, the foreign investors do not invest in India directly. Rather, the foreign investors make an investment into India through the tax haven route. And by doing so, they reduce their tax liability. The next form of misuse of the double taxation avoidance agreement is referred to as the round tripping. See, round tripping, as the name suggests here, under the round tripping, the money goes out of India either legally or illegally, and later on it enters back into India through the tax haven route. Now, for example, a number of Indians have stashed their black money abroad, let's say in Switzerland. Now this black money is once again making an entry back into India, wherein these Indians who have stashed their black money in Switzerland can probably register a shell company Y headquartered in Switzerland, and from there such a company Y can open branches in India. This is how a illegal money, that is a black money, can make an entry back into India. So this is a case of round tripping. Similarly, legally also, money can go out of India in the form of foreign direct investment, let's say to Singapore. In Singapore, a shell company may be registered. This shell company may not be carrying out substantial operations in Singapore, and from Singapore, this shell company open branches in India. So, in both of these two cases, whatever black money has gone outside India is once again making an entry back into India. That is why we call this particular route as the round tripping. So now the question arises as to, in spite of the misuse of the double taxation avoidance agreement, why is the Indian government not cancelling the DTAAs that it has signed with the tax haven countries? Now obviously, through the misuse of the double taxation avoidance agreement, the Indian government is missing out a lot on the tax revenue. But just imagine as to what would happen if we cancel the double taxation avoidance agreement that India has signed with the tax haven countries. Under such cases, the money would continue to go out of India either legally or illegally. Once it goes out of India, if we cancel the DTAAs with the tax haven country, then this particular money may not come back to India. Rather, this money would continue to flow to other countries with which the tax haven countries may continue to have the double taxation avoidance agreement. Now, for example, let's say India cancels the double taxation avoidance agreement with Mauritius, but Mauritius may continue to have the double taxation avoidance agreement with China. So in that particular case, whatever money goes out of India, whether legally or illegally, instead of coming back into India, it starts flowing to other countries such as China. Moreover, as we have seen under the treaty shopping, having the double taxation avoidance agreement with the tax haven countries is enabling India to attract foreign direct investment from the tax haven countries such as Mauritius, Singapore, etc. So if you do away with the double taxation avoidance agreement completely, then India would no longer be able to attract the FDI. That is why, as you must be aware, both these countries, that is Mauritius and Singapore, they are considered to be the largest sources of foreign direct investment into India. So the cancellation of the double taxation avoidance agreement with these two countries would lead to lower inflow of FDIs. However, this does not mean that India is keeping quiet as far as the misuse of the DTAAs is concerned. India is trying to introduce a number of amendments in the DTAAs in order to prevent its misuse. So let us now understand as to what was the Vodafone controversy all about. See, the investors from Hong Kong had opened a shell firm in Cayman Islands known as the CGP Investment Holdings. The CGP Investment Holdings held almost up to 70% shares in Hutchinson India SR. So what these investors had basically done was, instead of making an investment in India directly, they had routed their investment through a tax haven route. Earlier we had discussed that this route taken by the investors to reduce their tax liability is referred to as the treaty shopping. So what the Hutch company had basically done was, the Hutch company had resorted to the treaty shopping in order to reduce its tax liability in India. So far so good, until Vodafone company came into picture. Now the subsidiary of the Vodafone company, which is based in Netherlands, this Netherlands based Vodafone company wanted to take over the Hutchinson India SR company. Now just imagine, if this Vodafone company based in Netherlands had taken over the Hutch company in India, then the Vodafone company would have needed to pay the capital gains tax to the Indian government. So very cleverly, what the Vodafone company as well as Hutch company thought is, instead of doing this particular transaction in India, why not we do the transaction in the Cayman Island? So what Vodafone company did was, instead of taking over the Hutchinson India SR based in India, it took over the holding company itself. And once you take over the holding company, it is as good as saying the company owned by the holding company also comes under your control. So indirectly, by taking over the CGP investment holding in Cayman Island. The Vodafone company came to control the Hutchison India SR. Later on, very cleverly, Vodafone company then changed the name of Hutch to Vodafone. So what happened in this particular case? In this particular case, there was a transfer of assets based in India from Hutch to Vodafone. But this transaction did not take place in India. Rather, this transaction took place in Cayman Islands. So here, the Vodafone company was required to pay the capital gains tax not in India, but in Cayman Island. But in Cayman Island, the capital gains tax is almost equal to zero, and thus the Vodafone company as well as Hutch company escaped themselves from payment of the capital gains tax. So later on, when the Indian government tried to calculate as to how much would have been the capital gains tax if this particular transaction had taken place in India, the income tax authorities got to know that the capital gains tax would have amounted to almost around 22,000 crore. Undoubtedly, this is a very big amount. Accordingly, the income tax authorities served a IT notice to a Vodafone company asking the company to pay the capital gains tax worth 22,000 crore. In response, the Vodafone company responded by saying that this transaction was not done in India. Rather, this transaction was done in Cayman Island. Since the transaction is done in Cayman Island, the Indian tax laws are not applicable. Accordingly, the Vodafone company argued that it is not under any kind of liability to pay the capital gains tax to the Indian government. So the argument of the Vodafone company was based on the legal grounds wherein it argued that the tax laws of India are applicable only over the transactions that take place in the Indian territory. They are not applicable for the transactions that take place outside the Indian territory. So this legal argument put forth by the Vodafone company was upheld even by the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled in the favor of Vodafone company and termed the action of the income tax authorities as unfair. Now all the avenues for the government to demand the capital gains tax from the Vodafone company had closed. The main obstacle before the government to collect the tax from the Vodafone company was a law. So what the government did was, the government changed the law itself. And how did it change? See, the government inserted a provision in the Income Tax Act which says that if a particular transaction takes place outside India and if such a transaction involves the transfer of Indian assets, then automatically the companies would be liable to pay the capital gains tax. Now if you look at this particular provision, even though this particular provision looks very generalistic in nature, but looking at the kind of transaction that took place between Vodafone and Hutch, it can clearly be seen that this particular provision was targeted to demand the tax from the Vodafone company. But this particular provision alone would not be sufficient, because then the Vodafone company would have argued that this provision has been added now, but the transaction had taken place much earlier. Hence, to counter such an argument that can come from Vodafone company, the government inserted a second provision which says that the above said provision shall be applicable to all the backdated transactions as well. That is, those transactions that have taken place after 1962. Now, this kind of amendment which was done by the government of India is referred to as the retrospective taxation amendment, because this amendment is applicable to the past dated transactions as well. However, the retrospective taxation amendment done by the government of India was then challenged by the Vodafone before the arbitration tribunal. This was challenged under the provisions of the bilateral investment treaty that is signed between India and Netherlands, and now the arbitration tribunal has ruled in the favor of the Vodafone company. So far, the government of India has not clearly stated as to whether it will appeal against the order of the arbitration tribunal. Let us wait and watch as to how this particular story unfolds in future. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 2. Recently, the first look of the rapid regional transit system between Delhi, Meerut and Ghaziabad was unveiled. Now, the article that we are going to discuss here shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 1, particularly under the subsection Urbanization and its various issues. In this regard, let us understand various facets related to The regional rapid transit system, how is it different from metro and its benefits? See, the RRTS is a dedicated, high-speed, high-capacity, comfortable way of traveling between the two major cities in a region. So presently the government is implementing the regional rapid transit system in the NCR region of Delhi. This is implemented by the National Capital Region Transport Corporation. The RRTS can be considered to be similar to metro but on a much larger scale. For example, the RRTS connects multiple cities in a region, unlike the metros that may connect multiple parts of a single city. The RRTS has a design speed of almost 180 km per hour, which is almost twice the speed of metro. It takes hardly 1 hour to travel a distance of 100 km in comparison to 3 hours taken by metro. The average speed of RRTS is also in the range of 100 km per hour in comparison to 32 km per hour for the metro. As to why do we need the RRTS in the NCR region? Now the NCR region has grown over the years to cover the parts of the states around Delhi such as Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, etc. Today the total area of NCR is around 55,000 square kilometer with a total population of almost around 4.6 crores. Further, the decadal population growth of NCR is around 24% between 2001 to 2011 census. So this increase in the population as well as the number of vehicles plying in the NCR region has increased the travel time and has also led to the excessive pollution in the NCR region. So there are a number of benefits of implementing the RRTS in the NCR region. First and foremost, it will reduce the travel time and thus increase the overall productivity of the region, contributing to enhanced economic activities. The RRTS will lead to modal shift in the vehicles from private vehicles to the public vehicles, and accordingly this will lead to the lower emissions. It will reduce the traffic on the road. It will provide higher access to the jobs and various other facilities. And lastly, this would also lead to reduced energy consumption. Next on page number 4, we have the information related to the birth anniversary of Pandit Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. So let us understand some brief details about Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar from the perspective of the prelims examination. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar was born in the year 1820. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar was part of the Raja social movement called as Bengal Renaissance, which was initiated by Raja Ram Mohan Roy. So as part of the Bengal Renaissance, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar raised his voice against child marriage, polygamy, mistreatment of widows, etc. and ushered in new thinking. He received the title of Vidyasagar from the Sanskrit College of Calcutta for his excellent performance in Sanskrit as well as philosophy. He is considered to be a legendary educationalist as well as social reformer who challenged the basic orthodoxy of the Hindu religion. Through the various ancient texts, he suggested that even the widows could be remarried. Accordingly, he acted as one of the biggest campaigners for the Hindu widow remarriage. In this regard, he even petitioned the Legislative Council despite severe opposition. Finally, his suggestion to allow the widow remarriage was passed by the Legislative Council as a law in the year 1856. So these are some of the important aspects which you should know with respect to Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. Next on page number 3, we have an article related to the Fridays for Future movement. See, the Fridays for the Future movement, it is a global strike movement that started in August 2018 when 15-year school girl Greta Thunberg began a strike in Sweden. The basic demands of this particular NGO is to keep the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius, ensure climate justice and equity, and follow the Paris climate change deal in principle. Now we have chosen this particular article because if you have a look at the previous year prelims questions have been asked with respect to the important global NGOs. For example, in previous year UPSC prelims, questions were asked with respect to both Doctors Without Borders as well as Amnesty International. So in this particular case, Doctors Without Borders is a non-governmental international organization, whereas Amnesty International is a global human rights movement. Now the next article appears on page number 6. This particular article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of the signing of the peace deal between USA and Taliban. In this regard, this particular article discusses various constraints and challenges with respect to the peace deal. Now the various aspects of this particular article has already been covered by me in the DNS dated 1st of March 2020. In this particular article, I had covered as to what was the peace deal that was signed between US and Taliban, how the peace deal would benefit India, and what are the various concerns and challenges with respect to the implementation of the peace deal. So I would suggest you to go through this particular DNS dated 1st of March 2020 in order to understand the article in the today's newspaper. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Now let us have a look at the question for the day.